located in Statesboro, Georgia. We are WVGS 91.9, The Buzz. Hello and welcome to The Work, a show where I talk to professors about what they're doing when they aren't talking to students. I'm your host, Zero. Professor Christina Olson is an assistant professor of Writing and Linguistics at Georgia Southern University, where she teaches poetry and creative nonfiction. She received her undergraduate degree at SUNY Fredonia and her MFA at Minnesota State University. Her recent works include a full-length book of poems titled Terminal Human Velocity and an article about the chili dog that was published in The Atlantic. Projects she's currently working on include a book-length treatment of the chili dog, a third collection of poems, and a chapbook full of poems about mastodons. Additionally, she's the person who made me truly realize that talent and skill are curated and not God-given. Please welcome to the program, Professor Christina Olson.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for agreeing to show up. I was in your office one day and I was like, hey, please be on my radio show. And you were like, sure.
Yeah, I also saw you early this morning for a writing-related conference. So thanks for beginning and ending my day.
I'm so touched.
There's a lot of thank yous. This feels really sincere.
As I said, welcome to the program, both to you, Professor Olson, and to our listeners and the people who will eventually be listening to this in podcast form. I'm really excited to have you on. Like I said, you're the person who made me realize that I can actually work to get better at this writing thing. And I also just, wanted to have someone on who wasn't just an academic, because it's a university. I'm interviewing professors. A lot of those people are going to be writing for an academic audience, but you're not.
No, I write for a much smaller audience. But that was actually one of the things recently with writing for The Atlantic, is I was reminded of how easy it is to slip into that mode where we assume that our audience is as super interested in the regional chili dog as you are. And then to get notes back from editors that said things like, cut, also cut more.
So should you not assume that your readers are just as interested in the regional chili dog as you are?
I assume that they should be, because it's amazing. Because the Coney style hot dog is probably the greatest thing that was ever invented. But it is always good to remember that maybe for various reasons, people might not be as interested in a hot dog covered in a beef liver and ground beef mixture as you are, served up possibly across a really dirty counter, and that they might not also want to hear you geek out about it for 10 minutes. But I will say that that's what I'm in the business of doing, right, is teaching people to find what they geek out about and then how to get them to write about it so that other people do too.
That sounds like a really great way to make your living.
It is.
So we are going to go to a quick music break, and when we come back, we are going to play parts of speech. You're a little bit nervous about this. You were saying just before we went on air that you hadn't studied.
We could just play the Dessa song parts of speech and then call it a day.
I don't know what that is, and I'm going to have you explain it to me during the break. You are back here at WVGS on listening to The Work. I am your host, Zero. I'm here with Professor Christina Olson, and we are going to play parts of speech.
Am I ready? Yes, I'm definitely ready.
All right. First part of speech. Noun. Start with an easy one.
Dinosaur.
Tell me about what you did this summer. And okay, that sounds really ambiguous. Tell me about working with paleontologists this summer.
Paleontologists are a lot of fun because they are universally 10-year-olds that got to grow up and keep digging for bones. And they know this, and they have such an unbridled joy in what they want to do. So I was out at the Western Science Center in Hemet, California. Shout out to Dr. Katie Smith over in geology and geography, who works on mastodons and suggested that I could do things like come along. And so I was hanging out with these paleontologists, and I was trying desperately to not be really uncool and sort of failing miserably. So finally, at the end of day one, we went out to dinner, and I said, I just, like, I don't know how you guys don't freak out every time you find something. And they were like, oh no, we absolutely do. Like, we love what we do. We got to, grow up and keep digging for bones. So, yeah. So then after that, I was like, oh, cool. All right.
Yeah.
We're all like charmingly, geeky about these things. And I say that like in the best possible way. Because you should be driven by things that you find really interesting.
And you're writing a forthcoming chapbook of poems based on your experience with these paleontologists and the resulting exhibit.
Yeah, so what they did was an exhibition called Valley of the Mastodons. Western Science Center is home to the largest skeletal remains of a mastodon that have been found west of the Mississippi. So usually the East Coast mastodons are actually known as Beast Coast mastodons because they're so much bigger. And so they found the skeletal remains of one they call Max because he's enormous. And he's out there. And a lot of people know about woolly mammoths, or that's what they first think of. And apparently mastodons don't get nearly as much attention. So I was hanging out with these people who are like, no, I'm actually really into mastodons. I understand what mammoths are. But I am all about the mastodon. So part of it is about that. And of course, it gets into the history of paleontology. For example, Thomas Jefferson, when he dispatched Lewis and Clark, thought that mastodons were still roaming the West. And so they were told to like go get them and bring them back. And so like that's working its way in there, I said to a friend the other day that I started the first mastodon poem and like it almost immediately became about Thomas Jefferson. And then it actually almost immediately became about Sally Hemings, who Thomas Jefferson owned. So there's a lot of politics mixed in.
The political mastodon poem chapbook, I'm excited.
I know, you didn't see it coming, did you?
I didn't. I realized you said dinosaur and I asked you about mastodons.
That's fine.
What is your favorite dinosaur?
The Ankylosaurus.
Correct answer. there is one correct answer, and the Ankylosaurus. It's the best dinosaur.
Yeah, it had a club tail, and this is true. Because of its diet. They suspect that it was the dinosaur with the most flatulence. I don't know if I can say that on the air, but I did. It's science.
Not profane, obscene, or indecent.
No, it's nothing.
You had told me that before, but I had forgotten about it.
Oh, I brought this up multiple times. That's embarrassing.
No, because I think we've had this conversation before, talking about our favorite dinosaurs and why it's the ankylosaur and why all other dinosaurs are not as good. Yeah.
I mean, I've been a fan of the ankylosaur for a really long time. If I ever had a tattoo, it would be that. I'm going on record with that one.
Next part of speech, adjective. You just made a look of horror and disgust. I
was going to say geeky, but I've already said that like far too many times today. I'm going to go with, can I say self-aware?
Sure. Okay, I have the question. I just have to figure out how I want to ask it.
Mm-hmm. Work it out.
When you're writing a poem, how do you figure out where you end and the speaker begins? Or do you just let it happen, or is it sort of a very more thought-driven part of the process, or do you just see where the poem takes you and then decide if you like it?
There are times where I sit down to write about something, and I'm like, okay, this is going to be like mostly a Christina speaker. And then I start writing about something else entirely. And then I'm like, okay, yeah, no, that diverged pretty quickly. So I don't know what my... I guess I'm not ready to talk about that one yet. I will say that historically, when I first started writing poems, I was so very disinterested in what I had to say. Because I started writing poems when I was maybe like 19 years old. And I just didn't care. No one cares what you think, Christina. And that sounds really self-loathing. I don't mean it quite that way, but I think I was just aware enough to realize that it was going to be a lot more interesting if I tried to write outside of myself. Because, of course, like, parts of me were going to be back in that poem, right? Just in terms of the lens that I would choose or word choice. And so for a long time, almost all of my speakers were, like, very clearly the other. A lot of times they were from the point of view of, like, Bigfoot, or someone who's in love with Ernest Shackleton, the dead polar explorer. And then over the years, I became a little more comfortable with sort of relaxing a bit. But it took me a while to kind of figure out exactly what I wanted to write toward, and only then was I kind of more comfortable saying, like, this is pretty much the speaker and Christina Olson are clearly the same person in this poem. I did once write a poem called, the title of the poem is In Which Christina Imagines Different Alcohol Are Men and She Is Seeing Them All, which I thought was going to be like my lean into it, super ironic. Here's someone who dates all these alcohols. And that poem turned out to have, like, this life of its own. It's actually going to be anthologized in a textbook that comes out next year.
I actually...
And so my students would come up and they'd be like, oh, I Googled you and I found a poem about you in, like, booze.
Yeah, I actually, in preparing for this interview, I read that poem.
Exactly, of course you did. Why wouldn't you? It's on the internet.
Yeah, it's, I think tequila is my favorite.
Tequila?
Tequila's
the one
who steals your wallet and car.
Yeah, when you're in the bathroom.
Yeah.
And the bartender's like, you knew what this was.
Yeah. So you also are a teacher and writer of creative nonfiction. Do you find that you have the same, like, speaker self issues with creative nonfiction?
I tend to come, the more I've been writing creative nonfiction, it's almost the reverse. So when I first started writing creative nonfiction, it was pretty much in that mode that people think creative nonfiction is. Like, I am writing a personal essay that is also a memoir about things that happened to me in my childhood. Which is not to ever mock that mode, but I kind of ran out of all the interesting stories I had. I mean, I haven't had that fascinating of a life, which is good. It's been sort of drama-free. And so as I got more and more into nonfiction, it's really moved into adopting those other sort of, I mean, it's researched, right? And so, but it is kind of trying on those different voices. I read an essay by a former colleague and friend, Elena Passarello, in which she literally writes from the point of view of this tortoise that was, like, a personal pet of Charles Darwin, but her name is Harriet, and I think she just died, like, within the last 5 years.
Yeah, she was, like, the first Galapagos tortoise taken outside the Galapagos.
Yeah.
And by Charles Darwin.
Yeah, and Elena wrote this amazing essay about it, and I was like, oh, you can do that. And then after that, I kind of haven't looked back. So now the nonfiction I write tends to be, yeah, I mean, I'm still in there, obviously, somewhere, but I'm much more interested in meticulously researching something and then writing it in voice, which, by the way, some people say you can't do in creative nonfiction, but I do it.
Yeah, and I remember when I took creative nonfiction with you, we had a classmate who wrote from the perspective of two bowerbirds.
Yeah.
Who were going through their, very complex bowerbird mating ritual, and it was one of the best things I read that
piece was phenomenal and so beautiful and so much more interesting than someone, I mean, she had watched YouTube videos and documentaries about the bowerbird, and it was so much more engaging for that. It was from the point of view of the male bird. He was, like, getting his bower ready.
All right, our third part of speech, this one should be easy for you, it'll be hard for me. A verb.
Eating.
Oh, okay. You've given me an easy one. When I was practicing this game with, my roommates and anyone who would, sit down with me for like 10 minutes. And I may have told this story on the last episode, but my roommate gave me mixing. For his very sciencey job, and I was just like, you stir things and dilute alcohol. Tell me about that. No, but eating. So you just published, well, not just, recently published a piece in The Atlantic about how the chili dog sort of brings together different immigrant cultures and kind of is the American kind of melting pot personified. So I guess the question here is twofold. Why the interest in the chili dog? And is there like a greater interest in like food is important in our life and so we might as well examine it critically, or just wanting to talk about the chili dog?
So your question is 1 why and 2 why?
one why and 2 why.
And 2, no, how come?
Yeah.
So the why. So I was raised in Cincinnati, or I was born in Cincinnati, and my mom's family is still down there. And in Cincinnati, they have this Coney, which is you can't call it a chili dog because Cincinnatians will be upset. But it's a small hot dog covered in a chili, and then like draped in these mounds of cheddar cheese. Like I'm not kidding when I say it. It must be something like 6 ounces of shredded cheddar cheese. And the hot dog is really small. It's the size of like my index finger. So it's a lot of cheese to meat ratio. And so I just kind of assumed it was one of those Cincinnati things. Deadspin, I think a couple of years ago, listed it like the most disgusting regional food in America. Because of course they did. And so I had kind of forgotten about it. And then I was in Minnesota for graduate school. And I made friends with these people from Flint, Michigan, right outside Detroit. And I think I was probably running my mouth off one night talking about these Cincinnati cheese conies. And those people were like, well, that's not what a Coney is. A Coney is a hot dog. There's a Flint style one and a Troy style one. It's definitely from Michigan. It has no cheese anywhere near it. And so I was like, wait, what do you mean you guys have Conies too? And so I kind of thought it was like one of those, conversations you have after class. And then later that month, I got kind of reinvigorated by it. And then I fell down the internet hole. And I'm in this online writing group, right? We like have a prompt every month and, we post poems to each other. And so I turned in what was supposed to be like this really short poem about the Coney, and then it had 10 parts. Like it went on for a really long time. And then so, like one of the kinder comments I got was maybe this should be an essay, which I know is teacher code, right? For like, what are you even doing in this form? Like this goes on forever. So then I wrote an essay about it for a journal that dealt with Great Lakes thought and culture. And then I really kind of got into it and started seeing like the different ways, that this thing had migrated. And so, yes, it then became not only a little bit of an obsession, but, that the deeper I got into it, the more I realized like I'm actually really interested in food and regionalism and how we define ourselves and what we do with the cuisine of people who, immigrated here, and then we somehow like take it and make it ours, and then we claim it's always been ours.
Yeah, the American cuisine is always a sign that confuses me.
Right.
What? Like we just took other
things
food and
now
just
they're ours.
Smashed
the fact that they're all on the
together.
Menu together makes them ours, right?
Right. Yeah, so I'll see like Mediterranean Asian fusion and I'll be like, American food.
Oh yeah.
It's just like those crayons you used to get, and they had the connector, and you just jammed the crayons together until they came out. You came out with a green and orange crayon.
Yeah, or in my case, you left them on the dashboard of your dad's car, and you lived in South Carolina, and it was the summer. And then in the morning, you heard a lot of noises from the driveway, which is your dad like weeping about all the crayons in the car.
On that note, we are going to go to a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll move into the interview. I almost said internet. Into the interview proper. You're listening to WVGS 91.9 The Buzz. You are back here on WVGS 91.9 The Buzz. You're listening to The Work with me, your host Zero, and our special guest, Professor Christina Olson. So we just played parts of speech. I took some notes. I have some questions that I'm going to ask you. about that, about what you do when you're not talking to students. It's right in the tagline of the show.
Okay.
So one of the first things as I was looking through your all the research I was doing on you. God, that sounds so creepy every time I say it.
You can just call it Googling.
Well, that's the thing. I didn't use Google.
Wow.
I start on Georgia Southern staff directory page.
Ooh, okay.
and go from there.
All right.
The first thing, you have a book of poetry that came out just recently called Terminal Human Velocity, in which the first poem is about a woman jumping from the top of the Empire State Building. You have a forthcoming book about mammoths.
Mastodons.
Mastodons. Oh, I'm so embarrassed.
Yeah. Keep going. It's fine.
The English language is fake. You write a lot of poetry about science, I guess, is my point. And, when I try to convince my roommate that they're not at odds, we duel to the death. So how do you find that balance, or where does, I guess, the impulse to do poetry about science come from for you?
I come from a family of people who are into science. Like, my family's only half kidding when they play Name Your Favorite Physicist at cocktail hour. They're engineers, and they understand like how things work and thermodynamics. And my dad is a geologist. When I was growing up, there was like a lot of the natural sciences in our house. And then I hit probably 11th grade and started doing very, very poorly in science classes. And when I say poorly, I mean like low A's, high B's. But I mean, it was something that I was working at constantly in a way that I hadn't before. And I mentioned all this as background simply to say that by the time I got to college, I was like, I think that's it. I think I'm done. I don't understand how this works. I chose my undergraduate college in part because it didn't have a robust STEM program. And I knew that wouldn't matter. And so it was really kind of a surprise to me about 10 years ago when I sort of, quote, got back into science. And I think so much of that was a way for me to sort of marvel at the minutia and some of the facts of the scientific and the natural world. But I could also kind of do it on my own terms, right? Like, I wasn't taking a test on physics. And I always throw physics under the bus, but like, I am a kinetic learner. Physics is not my thing.
Right.
I mean, with the exception of gravity, I don't see it at work very often. So that's one answer. And I think the other answer is that even when I wasn't overtly or consciously writing about science, it was always what I looked to first, even in those really early days, because, we were talking earlier about how I was really consciously trying not to be the speaker of my own poems. And so the easiest way for me to do that was to look out at the natural world and find something far more interesting. A third way to think about it is that my anxiety disorder means that I really appreciate thinking about things on a geological time scale, because it means like my life doesn't actually matter that much.
That's a coping strategy. Don't let anyone pressure you into smoking cigarettes. Once you're dead on the inside, you no longer care if you're dead on the outside. And just think about everything on a geological time scale.
Yeah, like what, I will not lie. Like, you should Google satellite photos of Yellowstone, because Yellowstone is a caldera. It's a gigantic volcano, and one day it's going to blow us up. They think this will be like a while from now, but just, perspective, man.
I remember reading Bill Bryson's A Brief History of Nearly Everything. It might be a short history of nearly everything. I can never remember. But he has that part where he's talking about the KT event, and he talks to one geologist who's like, cored down as far as we can core, and this geologist is like, it looks like just about every, some obscenely large number of years, we have a big old something hit the earth and everything just starts over.
Yeah, it's like a reset.
And I'm like, that is oddly comforting.
It's in that book, I'm so glad you brought up that book, where he tells the story of, I think it's in the 70s, there's a geologist dispatched to Yellowstone, and they're trying to find the caldera. And he goes to the visitor center, and they have the blown up satellite photo, and the guy kind of realizes in awe that Yellowstone is the caldera. Like where he's standing, that's the whole thing. Like the whole thing will eventually blow one day.
Do you have a favorite science to write about?
I do tend to go natural world, in part because, I think it's an easy entry point. Like when in doubt, there's always some insect or some plant or some animal that is so much cooler and more deadly or like fascinating to think about. It's interesting that so many, I don't want to say so many, but especially the first poem in that book, Terminal Human Velocity, is a physics principle. I think it was sort of the challenge to myself to see if I could write it, which I succeeded at, except I forgot that when I would read it aloud, I would have to figure out how to articulate this really big equation. And the first time I realized that, I was reading to a group of people that included some of my friends in the sciences. And I was like, ooh, they're going to immediately figure out my blunder. So yeah. I also had my cousin who is a physicist fact check it for me.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of, I guess I just threw my roommate under the bus a little bit ago, but having two roommates who are both scientists, one of them doing fauna and one of them doing microbiology, makes all my nature poems really easy.
Yeah. I mean, there's points where I just kind of text people in my life and I'm like, hey, give me a fact, something I wouldn't know. And so I did that to Dr. Smith recently. And she just immediately came back. She was like, oh, actually, if you look at mastodon skulls, there's holes in it that fit tusks exactly. So clearly when these guys were battling, either for reproduction or just kind of for dominance, a tusk punctured one in the skull and then killed it. And I was like, yep, I can go with that. Done.
Yeah, that seems like a good jumping off point for a poem about giant mastodons fighting.
Yeah, you should always have a prompt like that in your back pocket, because if you don't want to write about it, you'll immediately find something else to write about, right? If you don't want to write about that, then your brain will be like, no, never mind. I actually wanted to write about, I don't know, honeybees.
When you're writing poems, so when you were getting Terminal Human Velocity ready,
mm-hmm.
Do you try to set out with a theme in mind? Do you let so obviously you're doing that with the just chapbook about mastodons.
Yeah.
Is that something you do often, or is it something you do rarely?
If I do have a moment where the poems are kind of coming together and I take stock of them, it's usually more than halfway through, because otherwise for a chapbook, you're right, it's a smaller book and those are sort of more thematically linked, but for the full length collections, I mean, the first one was kind of a combination of my master's thesis and then poems I wrote afterward. And so that was kind of, in some ways they were sometimes only united by Christina likes nature, right? And also epigraphs. That was kind of the working title of that book for a long time. And then for this one, it was kind of, that culling. And about halfway through, I was like, oh, these are kind of, I see where these are going. I think part of that is it takes me a long time to put a book together. Obviously, different writers do it differently, but it's not uncommon for some of my poet friends to have a new book out every year or two. And I think right now I'm it was 7 years between 1 and 2, and I'm still very much in the woods on book 3. Although that one actually I think does have its title already, which is pretty rare. So that's been kind of the unifying theme. But the title is Animals Doing Things to Other Animals, which is a very broad title.
just about as broad as you can get.
I know.
It just being,
otherwise, it would be too scary.
Yeah, just being things.
Right. Yeah, poems, in gold on the cover.
So in addition to a poet and a writer and a professor, you are the poetry editor for the journal Midwestern Gothic.
It's true.
I guess the first question is, what is the power trip of opening a poetry submission and being I have your fate in my hands feel like?
That's such a romantic God complex. Because mine is always please don't be about horses. At this point, I've been reading for them since 2012 and I love it. And I'm actually in the middle of submissions right now. So I've got, I don't know, whatever 183 times 3 is. That's how many poems I need to read between now and next week. Are you doing the math? What is
549 poems.
Yeah, that's a lot of poems.
You said... you said whatever 183 times 3 is, and I couldn't not do the math.
Yeah, and I was going to try to guess, and then I was like, don't spitball in the air. 4! No, that can't be right. Yeah, you can see why I wasn't so great at physics by the end of high school. Yeah, so a lot of times it's reading the poem, and then I always read in like packs of 3, because most people send us 3 poems. That's the length of an average poetry submission. So yeah, I mean, I really enjoy it. I will say that one thing that surprises me is that all these years later, I never read the cover letters until the very end. And sometimes I don't read the cover letters at all. Which you would think is like this important document, and it is an important document. But I got to a point where I found myself being swayed by them in ways that I didn't think were helpful. So now I just read the poems. And so it's actually a surprising range. Sometimes I'll find a poem and I'm like, yes, I love this poem. And if I actually look at our contributors' notes when the journal comes out, I'm like, this person's never published a poem before? Okay. Like I'm really surprised because they're very good at what they do. And then other times I'm like, oh yes, it does not surprise me to learn that this person has many, many books, and is like a full professor someplace.
So the name of the journal is Midwestern Gothic, and that's a pretty specific theme. Do you think that there's I don't want to say the audience for that, but I guess, how do you think that sort of niche in literature emerges, takes its place on the stage? Those are the same thing, just said differently.
We have this really receptive audience, I think in part because the Midwest is, like, we intentionally didn't define it. Even as editors, we sometimes disagree about what that might mean. And again, I'm kind of interested in regionalism and how we define ourselves via those somewhat arbitrary boundaries. And so, like sometimes we get writers from Arkansas and they'll say like, I don't know if I'm a Midwestern poet, and it's like, well, I don't know. But it doesn't mean that the work has to be set in the Midwest, which is where the kind of the Gothic part comes in. But the Midwest in general, I mean, is kind of this big sprawl. Some people think of like the upper Midwest, and other people will say like, no, Ohio is definitely Midwestern, but Pennsylvania isn't. Kentucky would never be the Midwest, whatever it might be, right? And so part of what I find really interesting is seeing what people do send us and where they send us work from. But at the end of the day, a lot of this is flyover country, right? I mean, it's people think of the West, they think of the West Coast, they think of the East Coast, they think of the South. They're not really clear on like kind of that swath in the middle and what that means. And so the journal was founded by 2 guys who are from Michigan who were really interested in giving it a more prominent stage.
You've mentioned regionalism and your fascination with it a couple of times now, and now you're nodding emphatically.
I am.
Outside of the U.S., do you have the same interest?
I don't know as much. Yeah, I mean, I'm always trying to figure out, like, this is not a American phenomenon, right? Like, I don't know. I've had my friend from Ontario, like, sort of chuckle derisively when people talk about Alberta, right? And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess that's a thing, right? And then she's like, well, you have to understand that Alberta is the Texas of Canada, which then made me laugh really hard, just because it was so precise, but it was still like very much couched in this American language, right? Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it just stems from the fact that I moved a lot growing up and I didn't really know where I fit in. I mean, we went from like Ohio to South Carolina, and then we went from South Carolina to New Jersey, which will give anyone whiplash. And then we went to Western New York, and then I did kind of like this tour of the Great Lakes. So that's the other thing too, is sometimes people are like, how are you the poetry editor of a magazine called Midwestern Gothic, but you're not actually from the Midwest and you don't even live there anymore? And then I'm like, I married a dude from Wisconsin, it's fine.
All right, that is actually all we have time for.
Let's end on that. I married a dude from Wisconsin, it's fine.
Yeah, if you're looking for a pull quote, all of you great podcast reviewers, I married a dude from Wisconsin, it's fine. Yeah. Professor Christina Olson.
Right. Feminist.
That's actually not our last word, though. So, as with all of my guests, I asked you to recommend a song to take us off the air.
Oh, yeah.
You recommended Stuck Between Stations by The Hold Steady.
Minneapolis. Represent.
And so, our podcast listeners will have to look this up on their streaming service of choice or YouTube, what have you. They're all out there. Just pay your artists. So, we take you radio listeners now to Stuck Between Stations by The Hold Steady. You're listening to WVGS 91.9 The Buzz.